Logic is, in a sense, the most fundamental field of inquiry within academic philosophy. It is also present, arguably by necessity, in every other formal discipline and even everyday life situations where careful, structured reasoning is required. The basic structure of a logical argument features premises and a conclusion. The premises of an argument provide evidence for the conclusion, which is usually signaled by the prefix therefore. In the study of logic, we are concerned with the relation between the premises and the conclusion. When the premises of an argument, if true, would support accepting the conclusion as also being true, then we can say that it is a valid argument. To prevent any misunderstandings later, however, we should be careful not to confuse the question of whether an argument is, quote, valid, and whether the premises of that argument are, in fact, true. Consider, if I expose myself to radioactive waste, I will gain superpowers. I have exposed myself to radioactive waste. Therefore, I will gain superpowers. Now, the second premise may be true, that I exposed myself to radioactive waste, but the first premise is clearly false. That's the stuff of comic books and Sunday morning cartoons. So, while the argument is logically, quote, valid, because the principal premise is not true, we should regard the conclusion with great skepticism, to say the least. Let's go back to what makes arguments valid. In order for the conclusion of an argument to follow the premises, the argument itself must be properly structured. The premises of a logically incorrect argument do not have the proper relevance or relation to the conclusion, even if they happen to be true. Consider, Bruce Lee is Asian. I am Asian. Therefore, I am Bruce Lee.
Illogical.
Here, both of the premises are true, but the conclusion is not supported by them. In fact, an argument can be logically invalid even if both the premises and the conclusion are true statements. Consider, all Vulcans are logical. Mr. Spock is logical. Therefore, Mr. Spock is a Vulcan. The conclusion that Mr. Spock is Vulcan, okay, fine, half Vulcan, is true, and both of the premises are true. But the premises do not actually provide any support for the conclusion. It's not hard to see the reason why this is if you substitute Mr. Spock with some other character like Selna Kohlrami, who was also highly skilled in both logic and strategy, while Kohlrami, despite being logical, was definitely not a Vulcan. He's a Zakdorn. The fact that the logical validity of an argument is independent of whether the premises and conclusions reflect true statements about the world may appear confusing at first glance, but this can actually be very useful, both in everyday life and especially in professional settings where important decisions need to be made in managing risk and predicting possible gains. People deliberate on the kinds of consequences that would seem to logically follow various options. Let's take a closer look at some examples of properly structured, that is, valid argument forms. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. This argument form is known as modus ponens, which means the way that affirms by affirming in the Latin. To reiterate an earlier point, the conclusion and the premises are related such that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Here's another valid argument form. If P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. This argument form is known as modus tollens, which means the way that denies by denying. If, for example, you suffer from a condition P, then you will have higher than normal levels of hormone Q in your system. Since you do not have higher than normal levels of hormone Q, you either do not suffer from condition P or it is dormant. Here is another straightforward, valid argument form. P or Q. Not P, therefore Q. And yet another. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. Therefore, if P, then R. Of course, there are other forms of arguing and proving the validity of arguments in logic. As you continue to complete the readings, pay close attention to how each of these forms are utilized and the kinds of common fallacies in logic, which is where we will turn our attention next.